Okay, well, I think we could get started now, and if there's some people that join us late, they can catch up. Buenas tardes y bienvenidos, damas y caballeros. I'm Anthony Squires, and I have the pleasure to be the moderator tonight for the Emiliano Zapata Memorial Lecture as part of TCC Connect's Hispanic Heritage Month celebrations, hosted by the Department of Behavioral and Social Sciences. Before we begin, I'd like to thank my colleagues, Misty Wilson Mertens and Leah Tarwater, for all the hard work they do. And I would also like to thank TCC Connect President Dr. Morales and Dean Sullivan for their continued support of programs like these. I'd also like to say that tonight your participation is welcome. If you would like to ask questions, please send them anytime during the talk using the chat box. And you can find the chat box by expanding the menu at the lower left-hand corner of your screen. At the end, we'll have some time to ask the speaker some questions, and he'll answer some. And then lastly, if you're attending tonight's event for extra credit, I'll be posting a link to a survey in the chat box at the end of the talk. This survey will be how we take attendance. So once again, if you're attending for extra credit, make sure that you fill out the survey, which I'll send out at the end of the talk. Emiliano Zapata was a prominent figure in the Mexican Revolution who championed the rights of agricultural workers and the poor by fighting against economic injustice and repression. It is this revolutionary spirit that we hope to call to mind during this Hispanic Heritage Month event, and that this lecture memorializes. This year, it is my honor to introduce Dr. Andrés Molina-Ochoa as the Emiliano Zapata Memorial Lecturer. Dr. Molina-Ochoa is joining us tonight from McAllen, Texas, where he is a professor of philosophy at South Texas College. His research investigates themes within the philosophy of law and business ethics. Originally from Colombia, he is especially interested in these things as they relate to Latin America. He holds a law degree from La Universidad del Rosario in Bogotá, Colombia, and a PhD in philosophy from the State University of New York, Binghamton. He was formerly a professor in the Faculty of Law at La Universidad del Rosario and has taught philosophy courses at the University of Baltimore, SUNY Old Westbury, and the John Jay College of Criminal Justice. Welcome, Dr. Molina.
Thank you. Before beginning, I want to thank Professor Squires for this invitation and this opportunity to share some ideas. So I wonder if you can see now my presentation.
Yes, we can see.
Okay, so I want to speak a little bit about legal philosophy in Latin America. And before beginning, I just want to tell you that I have a coughing, so I hope that does not interrupt you too much. And second, there are a lot of ideas here that are very deep in legal philosophy that we don't have time to address. So in that sense, the conference will be a little bit superficial. Okay. So I want to defend this idea that in Latin America legal theory, there is a tradition to transform, to modify, to distort legal theories as a tool of resistance. And I want to give two examples. One is legal positivism until 1990, and the second one is the right to the truth. Okay. Basically, what I want to prove is that Latin American scholars read European and Anglo-Saxon theories, and they totally change the content of these theories to be able to use this as a way of political intervention in their societies. I want to begin this theory with an anecdote of one professor. This is Professor Will Wallashaw, who's a professor at the University of McMaster in Canada. He's the founder of a theory who is known as inclusive positivism. So once he traveled to Brazil and he gave a speech, And people began to tell him, well, you're not right. That is not positivism. And he said, yes, it is. I created this theory. It's my own theory. And people say, no, 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 but this is not what we have studied for years, that inclusive positivism is. So you must be wrong. I say, no, I'm not wrong. It's my book. Okay, so bear this in mind just for a minute. Okay. So I'm going to explain what legal positivism is, how it has been understood. This is a very short introduction, and then how it has been transformed in Latin America. Okay. So legal positivism is the thesis that the existence and content of law depends on social facts and not on its merits. So the basic idea is that there are laws that are immoral, but the fact that a law is immoral doesn't mean that the law does not exist. The law still exists, the rules still exist. And the opposite, we may want the existence of a law, of a rule, because it's morally necessary, but if the law is not created by the Congress or by an authority, the law does not exist. So again, for legal positivism, the existence and content of law depends on social facts, for instance, the creation of a law by the Congress, and not on its merits. Okay, so that's the basic idea of legal positivism. By contrast, natural lawyers believe that the content of a law depends on its morality. So if a law is extremely unjust, the law does not exist, is not valid. So for instance, the laws that order the Nazis to murder Jewish during the Second World War, they were not real laws because they were incredibly immoral. That's what natural lawyers believe. So two important things. One, this theory was created by John Austin and Jeremias Bentham, and they didn't imply that morality is subjective. Both Austin and Bentham were utilitarians, so they believed there was a moral theory that was kind of objective and valid for everybody else. They believed that the principle of utility applies to every person. And the second thing, they didn't imply with legal positivism that there is not any relationship between morals and legal system. So the content of the law does not depend on morality, but they may influence each other. So for instance, Austin claims that if in the Congress must apply the principle of utility to create the best possible laws, the best possible moral laws. And in the same way, they claim that when judges are interpreting the law, they may use morality for those zones of the law that are a little bit obscure. So legal positivism does not imply that morality is subjective, and does not imply that morality and the law influence each other. What it implies is that the content of the law depends on a social fact, the creation of the law by the Congress or a decision by a judge. Now, if you read the books in which legal philosophy was taught in Latin America until very recently, I would say until the 90s and 80s, here there are 3 books, 2 Colombians and 1 Mexican. They have a lot of editions. So for instance, the one that you read on your right, Introducción al Derecho, written by Marco Gerardo Monroy Cabra, probably right now it's in its 22nd or 23rd edition. This is a very old edition, actually. All these books will claim the 2 ideas that I just say. They will claim that for legal positivists, morality is relative, and that there is a gap between law and morality, and that gap is absolute. They don't influence each other. So in other words, these 2 theses that were never implied by legal positivism, and actually they were against the founders of legal positivism, becomes the core of legal positivism in Latin America. So in Latin America, legal positivism does imply that morality is subjective. And in Latin America, legal positivism does imply that there is not any relationship between morals and the legal system. So it's a totally different theory. Okay. So the question is why? Why different, corrupt, distortion, wrong, misunderstood theory of legal positivism become popular in Latin America. And of course, you can go, and some authors claim that that's because of the absence of books. And this is an important topic that a lot of times is not understood by new generations. I always point out that the beginning of until the end of the 19th century, and one of the most visited libraries in the world was the Luis Ángel Arango Library in Bogota. That's the one that you can see. And the reason was not because it was a great library. It's not a very good library. It's very mediocre. But because it was the only public library in a city with more than 6 million people. So everybody used it before internet. So of course, that is one reason. However, I think the real reason why the theory was changed is political, and it's something like this. And let me see if I'm able to explain it. So when legal positivism began to be popular in Latin America, there was a movement, a natural law movement that was sponsored and supported by a cardinal of the Catholic Church whose name was Mercier. Is the one in your left. So the idea was to understood the law from the principles of Thomas Aquinas. So there was a kind of a triad. So the law comes from God and morality comes from God. So in a sense, religion, morality, and the law for this movement are the same. And this is the origin of a lot of conservative movements within the continent. Some of these movements actually were able to create their own laws. So for instance, the Colombian Constitution of 1886, establishing the preamble, the Constitution begins in the name of God, supreme source of all authority. And the Article 38 of the Constitution says, the Roman Catholic Apostolic religion shall be that of the nation. The public authorities shall protect it and cause it to be respected as an essential element of social order. So in other words, the dominant theory in Colombia is a natural law theory that equates law, religion, and morality. So what is law? Law is the union of morality, and that by morality I understand religion. So what is the best way to oppose this dominant position, to make kind of a revolt, to intervene, to resist against this position? Well, to deny the link is to claim that law doesn't have anything to do with morality, and morality doesn't have to do anything with religion, because morality is relative. It depends on what each person decides. So in other words, I have to the positivists were trying to think in a theory that was more radical than the one that was suggested by the Anglo-Saxons, by Bentham and Austin. But it was radical in the sense that it separates totally morality with the law and morality with religion, and morality with any absolute. Religion implies an absolute. There is a God that's universal. If we want to resist, we have to go to the other way. Morality is not absolute. Morality is relative. And in that way, we can resist the dominant position of the church in the state. So the outcome of that theory is Latin American legal positivism. It's a totally different positivism than the Anglo-Saxon and the European. And it establishes at its bottom the idea that morality is relative, and the idea that the law and morality are totally different spheres. Okay, but the reason is not theoretical. The reason is not actually to determine what is the law. The reason is to be able to fight in the law. In other words, is able to tell the people who were in power that they shouldn't brought these religious norms into the legal system. So let me go to the second example and try to clarify what I want to say. Second example is the right to the truth. So the right to the truth is considered now kind of a universal right. There is even a day for the right to the truth. That's the 24th of March. This day is understood as the right to the truth as a commemoration of the death of Monsignor Arnulfo Romero, who was a very important bishop in El Salvador, who was murdered. Um, okay, so most scholars claim that the origin of the right to the truth are the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Conventions are a set of regulations that appear, the last versions appear after the Second World War, before there were other conventions, and they rule they rule the basic rights of the people in times of war. What should we do if there is a war? How can we protect the civil population and so on? Okay, so the Article 26 of the Fourth Geneva Convention provides that each party to the conflict shall facilitate inquiries made by members of families dispersed owing to the war, with the object of renewing contact with one another and of meeting if possible. So basically, the basic idea is that each state must tell the people where are their disappears after a conflict, after a war, and that was all. So the right to the truth was understood by the Geneva Conventions and the international humanitarian law as a right to know what happens with the disappear after a war. Now, if you read what the right to the truth is right now, you will see that it's a totally different right. So this is a definition by the Institute of Transitional Justice, and it says victims of gross violation of human rights and serious violation of international humanitarian law have the right to an effective remedy. This includes the right to know the truth about the abuses they have suffered, including the identity of perpetrators. First difference. In the first one, I just need in the Geneva Conventions, I just need to know where are the disappear. Here, I have to know who committed the crimes, who committed the disappearance, who committed the huge violations of human rights, the causes that gave rise to the violations. So even more, I need to know why this happened, why there were violations, why there were people disappeared, and so on. And if appropriate, the ultimate fate of whereabouts of the forcible disappear. So it is a totally different right. And this right to the truth began in Latin America and in the first Commission of Truth that was in Argentina after the dictatorship. So Argentina is suffering a horrible dictatorship. It moves to democracy. And the president of Argentina of the time, Raúl Alfonsín, who is in the picture, encourages a very famous writer, Ernesto Sabato, commissioned to find the disappeared. If you read the name in Spanish, is Comisión Nacional sobre la Desaparición de Personas, National Commissions on the disappearance of people. It was just to find the disappearance, very close to the idea of the international humanitarian law. However, the commission that was outside the Argentinian state, they got a lot of help from the root movements, from social movements, began to gather something beyond its original mission, and they began to identify perpetrators, they began to identify where the people were executed, they began to identify the causes of the disappearance, and they began to reveal all the atrocities that were committed during the Argentinian dictatorship. Okay, now the Geneva Convention it seems that they don't have a clear political end. I mean, the idea of the right in the Geneva Convention is just figure out where are your disappeared. Here in Argentina, this basic idea of finding your disappeared has a political end. It's nunca más, never again. We don't want the Latin American states to commit the atrocities that happened during the Cold War. We don't want our states to torture people. We don't want our states to disappear people. Therefore, we have to remember the crimes that were happening. So the right to the truth becomes a political tool to intervene against what the state has been done for a long period of time. This kind of social struggle become a decision of the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. That's Velázquez Rodriguez versus Honduras. It's a decision of 1988. And for the first time, the right to the truth is understood beyond the original legal status of just finding the disappearance. Here, the Inter-American Court of Human Rights tells the state of Honduras, you have to tell why there were disappearances, the history of the disappearance. So, let me summarize and open to a discussion. So the legal theory become as a tool of political intervention. And why this is interesting? So if you read the most famous book in legal philosophy written in English is The Concept of Law, written in 1961 by Herbert Hart. In that book, basically Hart defends and makes legal positivism as a very abstract and coherent idea. So legal academics have been discussing for 50 years whether the law depends on morality or whether the law does not depends on morality. And so the question is, why do you ask that question? And this is a very problematic question in many ways. One, is there a law? Is there the concept of law is universal? Is the concept of law in the United States the same in Latin America? Is there any political implication of the concept of law? Why should we ask that question? So instead of that, Latin American scholars are not asking what is the law. They are creating their own concept of law. The law is this: to be able to intervene in politics, to be able to stop a way of a hegemonic understanding of the law. Okay. And the same I would say about the right to the truth. So the right to the truth is not only about finding the disappeared, because if you find the disappear, well, the causes that produce the disappearance may still be there. You may still have the same state that cause and produce hundreds and thousands of disappear in the state. So you may have cases. You may still continue with the causes. So the point is not to know what happened with the disappear. The know is to know why this happened. Why in Latin America in the 80s, in almost every country, there were dictatorships that commit huge atrocities. Why this was possible, and how can we avoid it? So the right to the truth is not only we must remember because this is a way to intervene in politics. And the other thing that I think it's important is that we really focus on the possibilities and limits of the legal systems. So if you read the legal theory, they will in Anglo-Saxon and European, you will find a lot of theories that will tell you law, we must obey the law because it represents the democratic values, because it represents the general interest, and so on. But the truth is that the law is created by senators and representatives that are thinking in everything except the general interest. They are thinking on the lobbies, on the people who actually paid in their campaign. So a theory that does not pretend to find what is the law, or that does not pretend to find what is an abstract function of the law and morality, but try to intervene in the system to protect the basic rights of the minorities, may have a lot of more sense. And also, most of the legal theories begin with the notion that the state is good and is protecting the rights of the people. But if you read the history of the right to the truth in Latin America, you will see that it tells the story of states that kill in one night 500 people, as Pinochet in Chile, or a state that disappeared thousands, as Argentina during the military junta, or you will see the story of how in one day Colombian government with paramilitaries cut the heads, the hands, feet, and testicles of more than 40 people and then throw them to the lakes. So you begin to question the state as a political. So maybe the state is not that wonderful institution that protects us. Maybe we need to remember to be protected from the state. Okay, that's basically my presentation today.
Okay. If any students or any of our guests have questions, you can type a question into the chat box by expanding the menu on the bottom left of your screen. I have a question for you, Dr. Molina. So in your discussion, you talked a lot about sort of a wider tradition in Latin America. But as we know, Latin America is a diverse region of the world that incorporates different countries, even different linguistic orientations, different constitutional arrangements. How is it that we can see patterns emerge in these kind of theoretical approaches that you've described?
Yes, that's a very important question. And let me answer in two ways. To speak about Latin American in this kind of sense is really superficial and it's not precise, definitely. Why? Because there are a lot of regions within Latin America with a totally different legal development, especially in the Caribbean. Nevertheless, there are a lot of patterns common within a lot of Latin American countries. And the reason why is this. There are two reasons. Most of the Latin American civil codes, and by civil codes is the legal rule that specifies the rights and obligations of people respecting to private rights, to property rights. So, for instance, how do you sell a house? How do you buy a property? How do you rent? Well, anyway, this code is copied from the Napoleon Code in France, and it was translated in Chile by a Venezuelan, Andrés Bello. And this code became the civil code of most countries in Latin America. It became the civil code in Peru, in Ecuador, in Colombia, in Venezuela, in Mexico. So a lot of Latin Americans have like a political different law, that's the Constitution, but a common civil law. And they studied with the same books that were actually written in Chile and in Mexico. Most of the books that Latin American studied until very recently, this changed in the last 20 years, 30 years, where Requesens, who was a Mexican, Garcia Maínez, who was a Mexican, Alessandri Rodriguez, who was a Chilean, and you go to Latin American libraries and they study basically the same books and apply very similar norms. And the philosophy of law in a very different way than Anglo-Saxon, this is also something that deserves a deeper study, was studied related in as a chapter of civil law and not a political law. So whereas in the United States, the philosophy of law was a problem of constitutional law, in Latin America, it was a problem of civil law. Why? I still don't know. So there was a kind of pattern excuse me, of common understanding of the law that makes a tendency in the region for a lot of countries, not for all of them, but for a lot of countries.
We have a couple of questions here from students. Allison would like to know if you see less dictatorships in, I guess, in Latin America now, and maybe if so, could you expound on the relationship of some of these legal theories to that?
Yes, I think that's a wonderful question. Yes. Think about this. In the 80s, almost every Latin American country had a dictatorship. There were the junta militar in Argentina, there was Pinochet in Chile, there was Stroessner in Paraguay, there were dictatorship in Peru. In Colombia, there was no dictatorship, but there was something that was called the Estado de Sitio. The translation is state of siege, I think is the translation. Basically give the president the ability to stop any human rights if the president wants it. And even civils could be judged by militaries. So it was a hidden dictatorship in reality. Okay. Now there are less in Latin America. There are still dictatorships, but there are a lot less. And I do think that the right to the truth has helped to stop it, because people are scared of dictatorships. Of course, one part of the answer of the reason why there are less dictatorship is because the end of the Cold War. That also true, but there is also the political movement that we don't want another dictatorship. We don't want this happen again. And you see, for instance, in Argentina, that every time, with all the mistakes, all the problems that have been in Argentina in the last times, you may claim that they have been very bad governments, of course, but every time something similar to the dictatorship is happening, people go out to the streets with the Nunca Más book, with the book written by the Commission of Truth, and they tell us we don't want this to happen again. So the memory of the massacres helps as a way to motivate people to stay alert what could happen. And that's the reason why the history is so important. It's so important to remember what has happened to our countries. And that is not a vaccine, a perfect vaccine, in the sense that, because we remember there are not going to be dictatorships. Of course, there are still dictatorships in Latin America, and some of them are very bad. But if you compare to the landscape in the 80s, the situation is a lot better. And there are a lot of improvements in a lot of senses.
What was the role of the United States during this period of time?
Well, the United States, Latin America was in the middle of the Cold War. So there were two armies, the Soviets, who were supporting a lot of guerrillas, and the Americans, who were supporting dictatorships. And there was a school that was the famous School of the Americas, La Escuela para las Américas, in which the dictatorships were trained to torture, to use electricity in the testicles of the people. There is no doubt that the American government supported Pinochet and the coup d'etat against Allende in Chile. The United States supported the militaries in Argentina. There are documents of the CIA that are incredibly. So the Argentinian militaries were very effective destroying the guerrilla of the time, who were the Montoneros. Was a Marxist, not very radical, to be honest, guerrilla in Argentina. They were very effective, and very effective by doing horrible. They disappear hundreds and thousands of people, torture, rape women, steal the children of the women. It's a horrible massacres. One of the commentators of Juan Mendez, who's one of the most important historians of that period of time, he claims that the crimes committed by the Argentinian dictatorship can only be compared with the Nazis. I mean, in their cruelty. So when the United States realized that the Argentinian militaries were, although their cruelty, they were very effective against the guerrilla, they paid them to go to Central America, and they moved them to countries such as El Salvador, to train the governments of the region to fight the guerrillas that were at that time in Central America. So in other words, to replicate the same atrocities in another part of the continent to fight against the communist guerrillas of the time. This is just one of the examples of the American involvement of the period of the 80s and the time.
Okay, we have another question from Natalie, who asks if the torturing was religiously motivated.
Before that, it's an important question, but for that, it isn't just to claim that was the only involvement of the United States. Because at the same time, there were a lot of NGOs, organizations that also, against sometimes the American government, try to defend the human rights in Latin America. So the influence of the United States is more complicated. Okay, coming back with the question of Natalie, what was the question again? Could you?
She wanted to know about if there were any religious motivations involved in the torturing.
Yes, there was a strong support of that changed in every country, and that's quite interesting. And that's one of the reasons why Professor Squire's question at the beginning is so relevant. But for instance, in Argentina, the Catholic Church supported blindly almost entirely, with few exceptions. There were exceptions, but the hierarchy of the Catholic Church supported almost entirely the dictatorship, and they protected the dictatorship, and they helped to justify the dictatorship, and some of the hierarchy also in Chile. However, in Chile, by contrast with Argentina, the majority of the Catholic Church fought for human rights, and there were actually bishops who were disappeared by the government. So that changed in every country. Now, this time of dictatorships in the 80s and 70s, 80s. But if you begin if you pay attention at the beginning of the century in all Latin America, there is a huge participation of Catholic Church in the project of creating a nation that excludes every possible minority. So if you read the text, there are texts, and from a historian perspective, this is quite horrifying, that tells something like this: it is time to reconvert all the indigenous people. And by that you mean you have to teach them to be Catholics, and you have to adapt it to the Western civilization, meaning destroy their identity, finish their culture. And you will find texts like that on almost all the continent, in many different countries. So answer in different ways. Yes, there was an influence on some religions, not only the Catholics. In some countries, there was support of the Catholic Church to the Argentinian dictatorship. And two, before the dictatorships in the beginning of the 20th century, in the project of creating a nation, the notion of a nation that has an identity also was supported by some Catholic, by some religion, and excluded minorities. Yes, in this sense, yes.
We could also say that the question of religion is a very complicated one in this scenario as well, because if you look at sort of some of the left-wing Catholic priests in Latin America at the time, the liberation theologists were essentially Marxists who would have been opposing a lot of these right-winged governments. Is that correct?
Totally true. That's also the other side of the story. In the 70s, after especially two meetings, one in Puebla in Mexico and the other one in Medellin, the Catholic Church adopted some of the idea of the theology of liberation. And the basic idea is that they have three basic ideas. One is that the Catholics and later other Christians should adopt as the poor, the most poor, as the preference position. So my love cannot be universal. I have to pick up one to really, really love, and that I should really, really love should be the poorest in my society. Second, they understood that we could use Marxism to understand the scriptures. So they understood, for instance, the Exodus as a fight between slaves and slave owners. So that was the second principle of the theology of liberation. And they did support a lot of liberation movements and social movements. In El Salvador, as I told you, Monsignor Romero was a supporter of the theology of liberation. He was murdered. The Jesuits also in El Salvador, they were 9 murdered. In all Latin America, even the ones I mentioned in Chile, who opposed the dictatorship of Pinochet. Yes, there is that part of the Catholic Church that also fought against the dictatorships. That's totally true.
I might mention you've mentioned Oscar Romero a few times. There's a good movie called Romero. If anyone's interested in finding out more about this guy. I have a few more questions here. Let's take one from Fadwa. Fadwa wants to know, is Latin America's legal system improving? And if so, is it close to having a morally good, fair system?
I mean, it's difficult because I would say in general terms, if we compare with the 80s, yes. there are a lot of problems in a lot of countries, and there are a lot of countries that are going backwards, in my opinion. Nevertheless, if you pay attention to the rights that have been established by the Constitution, the voices, for instance, until very recently, a country such as Bolivia, that the majority of people in Bolivia are indigenous people. Until Evo Morales got the power in Bolivia, the indigenous people didn't have a voice, and this is a country in which the majority are indigenous. So the possibility to recognize this in the Colombian Constitution of 1991 give to the indigenous population the right to have their own laws, their own justice. So I would claim that in a lot of senses, the Latin American law in the last 20 years have improved. Of course, there are countries that maybe are going backwards, and there are the two tendencies. I mean, the history is not a clear stage when you can see very clear what is going to happen or what is happening. But I would say as a tendency, the majority, I think it's there. And that doesn't mean that it's good. There are a lot of problems. But I would say even more. I think that the legal theory in Latin America has helped to do this. And the most important legal theory in the last years in Latin America is a theory that's not as neo-constitutionalism. And neo-constitutionalism suggests that people have collective rights, and they are as important as the private rights. And that has given the governments the obligation to protect the rights to the ecology, the rights to the environment. And this is very problematic. I mean, the Amazon region is almost being destroyed. But thanks to these rights, the destruction has been slower than could be. So I do think that the legal system have improved as a general tendency, not in every country and not in every respect, but as a general tendency, I would say yes, and I would say that the legal theories have contributed to do it by the way they understand the theory and change the contents of the theories in the application of the law.
Okay, we have a question from Daniel. He says, you stated that Colombia established the Roman Catholic Church as the state church in the Constitution. I like this question because it's a question about civil religion, which is the topic of my research. And he wants to know, do you still see a major influence in the politics and law in Colombia from the church?
Yes, I think this question, because let me clarify. In the Constitution of 1886, the Catholic Church becomes the official religion in Colombia. But the Constitution was changed in 1991. In 1991, Colombia established itself as a lay state without any particular religion. So that means that that doesn't mean that the religion stopped having power. There is a lot of influence of the Catholic and Protestants. So the Colombian of the 19th century was majority Catholic. There has been a lot of conversions in the end of the 20th century, beginning of the 21st. So there are a lot of religious groups in Colombia. And that's even more problematic because some of these religious groups have their own political party. So there is one political party, for instance, that's known as MIRA. MIRA was created by a church that's, I forgot the name, it's Iglesia of, I forgot the name. It's created by a religious group, and the political party works as a hand of the of the religious group, and that's quite complicated. And that influences the creation of the norms and the elections of the justices of the Constitutional Court. So the struggle to keep the church and the state separate is still an important issue in Latin America. And it's an important issue in topics such as abortion, gay marriage, adoption of children by gay couples, by same-sex couples, and this is a fight that is being done even right now. I would say in every country in Latin America, this is a problem that is happening right now. This is a struggle that is happening right now.
Why do you classify it as a problem? I mean, are they any different than any other interest group that might organize into a party?
Well, there are worse interests, but that's some. I would say because most of the cases in Latin America they have been very, very conservative and against the freedom of the people. So they're against gay marriage, um, rights of the women. So these influence of the religious groups in Latin America haven't been to defend the rights of the minority. They have not been, with very few exceptions, liderated by the Theology of Liberation. In part because the Catholic Church cut the head of the Theology of Liberation when Ratzinger, who later became Pope, was the cardinal for the defense of the faith. I forgot the name in the Catholic Church. So these groups that have influence are always the most conservative, are almost always in each, and they defend always very difficult, in my opinion, very complicated political ideas.
Okay, we have one more question. Again from Allison, would like to know what happened to the fallen dictators. Did they escape? Were they charged?
Well, that changed in each country. There were a lot of attempts to charge Pinochet. It was never possible. In Argentina, the history in Argentina is fascinating because they were charged, then they were forgiven by Menem, who was the president in the 90s. There was a law that was called the law of punto final, of final. How would you translate that? Final point? No, the final end? No, I don't know. Anyway, and when Kirchner was elected, he said, no, that law doesn't make sense. They must be found guilty. And a lot of the dictatorships of the members of the military army who participated in the massacres in Argentina, they were sent to jail. Some of them actually died in jail because they were very old by the time they were arrested. Some of them die without any. Stroessner died without any consequence in Paraguay. So that changed in every country. The thing is that I would say most of the cases, dictatorships end up in impunity, and the reason why is that these struggles take not years, decades. So when the struggle to remember and to incorporate the memory into the legal system becomes possible, the dictatorship is too old that he dies or he's dead. But excuse me. But in some cases, particularly in Argentina, the dictators really did went to jail, and they pay some jail for their crimes.
Let me just follow up with another question on that, because for example, the Northern Ireland case is an instance of the right to know, right? But in a lot of these cases, if I'm not mistaken, as kind of part of this right to know, there's a immunity that is given to people that commit crimes. And it's almost in exchange for the information about where the bodies are, what happened, that they're granted immunity. Could you talk about that a little bit?
So yes, this model began actually in the commission in the True Commission of South Africa. So they devised this idea: if you confess your crimes, you can have some kind of immunity, but if you don't confess it and you're found guilty, you will be subject to some punishment. This model was copied in a lot of countries, not only in Ireland, but also, for instance, in the last peace process of Colombia with FARC. That was the original idea. And so a lot of people claim, so here's the point, a lot of people claim that the right to the truth is actually a way to condone and produce some kind of impunity, because the criminal is saying all the crimes and at the same time is not going to jail. Nevertheless, I think this is a distorted idea of the right to the truth for three reasons. One is that this impunity that is given to the people that tell the truth can be changed later. and that happened in Argentina. So the government could say, "Oh yes, I gave you impunity, but nah, come on, go to jail." And the second reason is this, because after a conflict, a very big conflict, the punishment of all the responsibles is almost impossible. So it has to be some level of impunity. So think about the Colombian war, civil conflict, internal conflict. In the Colombian internal conflict, if you have to put to jail a lot of members of the guerrilla, a lot of members of the paramilitaries, a lot of members of the army. So
A lot of members of the current Congress.
so they're of the Congress. So there are no jails. That's impossible. So you have to give impunity. So probably it's more important than punishing people to realize, to make public what happened, why it happened, to avoid these actions in the future. So the idea is that we have the idea, and I always have thought this is an intuition, maybe I'm wrong, that we in the United States have this idea that justice is the superhero justice. There's a bad guy and I have to send them to jail, to a health institute, mental institution, as in Batman. But probably justice is not about punishing the criminals. It's about knowing why things happen and creating a state in which these horrible events never happen again. And instead of a jail or a prison, change the notion of punishment to compensation, to reparation to the victims. So the victims don't have to suffer the outcome of the crimes and the violation again and again and again. So, for instance, there are criminal systems. So, for instance, in Norway, in which the criminals are sent to kind of a hotel and they are treated very well, and that had worked very well for that country. So probably we should focus, even with horrible criminals, not in the punishment in the sense of sending to jail and make them suffer, but punishment in the sense of telling the truth, tell the story again, make your country a different country in which atrocities are never happen again. Empower people so the state doesn't have the power to destroy you, and at the same time repair the victims, make the victims good again, and probably that is the target of the right to the truth. And in my opinion, is a better target than the punishment of the dictators.
I think we have just a couple more minutes. Let's do one more question from Daniel. So he asked, do you feel that you can't have justice without truth?
I think truth is an important element of the justice. And we must know, I mean, people must, if you speak with victims, the first thing, most of the victims, before the punishment, I mean, of course, they want also the punishment of the perpetrators, but the first thing that they want to know is what happened with my son, what happened with my daughter, where is she? Because a lot of the time they don't know where are the corpses, who ordered it. So that's the beginning of justice, is to know the truth. My opinion, you cannot have justice in a country or in a society that doesn't know the truth of the violation of human rights. And I would say more, that's very important in the United States. Why? Because most of the Americans don't know the history of their own country and the history of the violation of human rights committed by their own country. So I think this begins by this applies everywhere, not only in Latin America.
Well, thank you, Dr. Molina. For everyone out there who is attending this event for extra credit, I'm going to paste the link to the survey. So make sure that if you're attending for extra credit, you click on this link, answer a few questions there, and then I'll have that information, or whoever your professors will have that information to give you some extra credit. Once again, thank you, Dr. Molina. It's a pleasure to see you.
Thank you for the invitation. Thank you a lot.
Okay. Nice job, Andres. Thank you. Thank you a lot.
Okay, thank you. So can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you. I can
Only
hear
you
you.
or everybody?
Everyone can hear you.
Okay, so you call me later or?
Yeah, I'll call you in a few minutes.
Okay, perfect.
I'll
Okay,
call you on
thank you all.
Facebook.
So I can
Okay?
close now, no?
Yeah, I'll call you on Facebook. Okay?
Okay. Okay,
Okay,
good.
thank you.
Bye-bye.
Courtney, I don't remember I have 4 sections online. I don't remember which one that you're in, but I know your name. So if you don't know the section number, that's okay. Pasting that link again. Does anyone have any questions for me before I log off? Allison, no. If you attended in person, then you do not have to do the essay. My email is anthony.squires@tccd.edu. That's my email address there. You're welcome.